In a quiet town, a vigilant parrot fixed its gaze on an old sewer hatch. Daily, its peculiar behavior aroused curiosity and caused astonishment among residents. Amid the mystery hovering over the hatch, a surprising event united the hearts of the community. Hidden secrets emerged, transforming everyone's fate. Before discovering every detail of this moving account, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories. In the peaceful town of Pine Valley, where time seemed to flow more slowly and people still greeted each other by name, Mrs. Betty observed with growing curiosity the peculiar behavior of a parrot with vibrant green and blue plumage. Every day, promptly at 6 in the morning, the bird landed near an old sewer hatch on Maple Street, carrying in its beak pieces of food that it carefully deposited through the cracks of the rusty metal. The 65-year-old woman, known for her kindness and the most flowery garden in the neighborhood, had begun to notice this pattern about 2 weeks ago. Initially, she thought it was just another of nature's eccentricities, but there was something in that parrot's gaze, an almost human urgency that deeply intrigued her. "Frank, come see this," she called to her husband on a particularly sunny morning. The couple, along with some neighbors who had also noticed the bird's unusual routine, began to follow this intriguing ritual daily. The parrot not only left food but also emitted sounds that seemed like calls, as if trying to communicate something important. Sarah, the journalist from the local newspaper, the Pine Valley Voice, was the first to document the phenomenon. With her camera always ready, she began to record not only the parrot's behavior, but also the marks that were beginning to appear around the hatch. Mysterious scratches suggesting that something or someone was responding to the bird's efforts. News of the watchful parrot, as it came to be known, spread quickly throughout the town. Children began making drawings of the mysterious bird, elderly folks discussed theories during their domino games in the square, and even the mayor, in his last public appearance, mentioned the case as a phenomenon worthy of investigation. The mystery intensified when Mrs. Betty began to hear faint, almost imperceptible sounds coming from inside the hatch. "These aren't just sewer noises," she insisted to anyone who would listen. "There's something else happening down there." The community, initially skeptical, began to pay more attention. Merchants from the surrounding area started leaving bowls of water and food near the site in solidarity with the parrot's inexplicable effort. The baker, Mr. Joe, swore he saw the bird talking with another parrot, as if they were plotting something. Sarah, realizing there was more to the story than appeared, began a deeper investigation. In her notes, she recorded curious patterns. The parrot always appeared at the same times, its flights followed a specific route, and more intriguingly, it seemed to have a preference for certain types of food, especially sausages and pieces of meat. The journalist also noticed something disturbing. In recent weeks, there had been a significant increase in the number of social media posts about missing animals in the region. Although there wasn't an obvious connection, her instinct told her there was a bigger story waiting to be discovered. Meanwhile, Mrs. Betty continued her silent vigil, observing the parrot with growing admiration. She began keeping a detailed diary of her observations, noting every small detail of the bird's behavior. "There's an intelligence in his eyes," she wrote in one of her entries, "a wisdom that goes beyond animal instinct." As the days passed, more people joined the informal vigil that formed around the hatch. Volunteers from the local animal shelter began making regular visits, intrigued by the increasingly frequent reports of mysterious sounds coming from underground. The parrot, apparently oblivious to the commotion it caused, continued its daily mission with unwavering dedication. Its methodical and persistent behavior began to arouse not only curiosity, but also a feeling of admiration and respect in the community. It was on a Thursday, as the sun began to set and the first stars appeared in the sky, that Mrs. Betty made a decision that would change not only her life, but that of the entire town. She would discover, whatever it took, what secret that parrot was guarding so zealously. The next morning, Mrs. Betty woke before dawn, determined to solve the mystery. Equipped with a flashlight, gardening gloves, and accompanied by Sarah, who insisted on documenting everything, she headed to the hatch. The parrot, as if sensing the importance of that moment, was already there, more agitated than normal. "He seems different today," Sarah observed, adjusting her camera. "More anxious, perhaps." The bird flew in. circles emitting sounds that seemed like a mixture of calls and incomplete words. Its movements were more frantic, almost desperate. As they approached, a distinct sound emerged from the depths of the hatch. A weak meow, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Mrs. Betty and Sarah exchanged meaningful looks. The parrot at that moment landed on the lady's shoulder, as if giving its approval for what was about to happen. With the help of some residents who were beginning to gather, including Mr. Joe the baker and Tom the janitor from the neighboring building, they managed to remove the heavy cover from the hatch. What they found left everyone speechless. 3 kittens, skinny and frightened, were huddled in a small dry space, surrounded by remnants of the food that the parrot had deposited over the weeks. "I can't believe it," whispered Sarah, photographing the scene. "All this time he was feeding these kittens." The discovery caused a wave of emotion among those present. The parrot, now calmer, observed everything from atop a nearby post, like a guardian satisfied with the outcome of its mission. The news spread quickly through the town. Veterinarians were called, and the kittens, after being carefully rescued, received immediate medical attention. They were dehydrated and malnourished, but alive, thanks to the unlikely intervention of a parrot that refused to ignore their suffering. During the rescue, Sarah noticed something disturbing. There were recent marks around the hatch suggesting that someone had deliberately placed the kittens there. "This wasn't an accident," she commented, photographing the evidence. "Someone abandoned them here on purpose." The discovery triggered a series of disturbing revelations. Residents began reporting having seen a dark car circulating in the area in recent weeks, always late at night. Others mentioned having found social media posts about a challenge that involved abandoning animals in unusual places. Mrs. Betty, deeply touched by the situation, offered her home as a temporary shelter for the kittens. "It's the least I can do," she said, "after all the effort of this extraordinary parrot." The bird, as if understanding, began to make regular visits to her garden, where the kittens were recovering. Sarah, meanwhile, began connecting the dots. In her initial investigation, she discovered that similar cases had been reported in neighboring towns. "There's a pattern here," she explained during an emergency meeting at the Residents' Association. "This isn't a coincidence." The community, mobilized by the discovery, began to organize. A group of volunteers established shifts to watch strategic points in the town. Security cameras were installed in suspicious locations, and a direct line for reports was created. The parrot, now considered a local hero, continued its routine, but in a different way. It began to circulate through other areas of the town, as if looking for more animals in danger. Its behavior inspired other residents to become more alert and to report cases of abandonment. Meanwhile, on social media, the story of the vigilant parrot went viral. Journalists from major outlets began arriving in town, attracted by the unique narrative. But for Sarah, this was just the tip of the iceberg. In her notes, she began tracing connections between the abandonments and a specific group of influential people in the region. The discovery of the kittens wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something much bigger. A plot that would involve the entire town in an investigation into animal cruelty, power, and the surprising capacity for compassion demonstrated by a simple parrot. Sarah began spending her nights investigating social media, delving into a disturbing universe of hashtags and viral challenges. At her workstation in the local newspaper's office, piles of notes accumulated as she traced connections between different cases of animal abandonment in the region. "Look at this," she showed Mrs. Betty, who had become her informal partner in the investigation. On the computer screen, several posts displayed the same pattern: animals abandoned in unusual places, always accompanied by a specific hashtag. Extreme Pets Challenge. The phenomenon seemed to have started 3 months earlier in a neighboring town, when a local digital influencer, known as Content King, published a video suggesting that his followers innovate in their way of getting rid of unwanted animals. What started as a distasteful joke quickly transformed into a dark trend. Meanwhile, the 3 rescued kittens were recovering at Mrs. Betty's house. The parrot, which now answered to the name Guardian, made regular visits, bringing small gifts: leaves, twigs, and occasionally pieces of paper that would prove important to the investigation. "It can't possibly be a coincidence," murmured Sarah, examining one of the papers brought by the Parrot. It was a piece of a flyer with the logo of a local event company, Elite Entertainment, known for organizing luxurious parties for the region's high society. The reporter began to notice a disturbing pattern. Several of the abandonment cases coincided with the dates of events organized by the company. On their social media, she found photos of parties where exotic animals were used as attractions, only to disappear afterward. Mrs. Betty, using her network of contacts built over years of volunteer work, began to receive troubling reports. "A former employee of Elite Entertainment contacted me," she confided to Sarah. "She has information about a larger scheme involving important people in the town." The source, who preferred to remain anonymous, revealed that the company served as a front for a group that promoted extreme experiences for wealthy clients. Animal abandonment was just one of the group's activities, which also organized urban safaris and treasure hunts with devastating consequences for local wildlife. Guardian the Parrot, as if understanding the gravity of the situation, began to exhibit even more intriguing behavior. It started making regular flights over Elite Entertainment's headquarters, sometimes returning with small objects, discarded badges, pieces of documents, evidence that gradually built a solid case. "He's not an ordinary parrot," observed Sarah, after seeing him return with a lost flash drive from the company's parking lot. "It's as if he understands exactly what we're looking for." The device, although damaged, contained fragments of spreadsheets with dates and locations of future special events. The investigation gained new momentum when other residents began sharing security camera footage. In several videos, it was possible to see luxury cars stopping in dark areas of the town late at night, always following a pattern similar to the abandonment of the kittens found in the hatch. Mrs. Betty, using her influence in the community, organized a citizen surveillance group. Equipped with cameras and cell phones, volunteers began monitoring strategic points in the town, especially during Elite Entertainment events. Guardian the Parrot, surprisingly, seemed to coordinate these actions, flying between groups and alerting them to suspicious movements. The reporter began receiving anonymous messages with increasingly detailed information about the structure of the scheme. One of them caught particular attention. "Look for the connection between Elite Entertainment and the Municipal Events Council." The answer lies in campaign donation records. The net was beginning to close, but Sarah knew they needed to be cautious. The deeper the investigation became, the more they realized they were dealing with powerful and influential people. The challenge now was not only to expose the truth, but to do it in a way that could not be ignored or covered up. As night fell over Pine Valley, Mrs. Betty watched Guardian the Parrot on his improvised perch in the garden. "You knew everything from the beginning, didn't you?" she whispered. The bird just stared at her with its bright eyes, as if still guarding even more secrets to be revealed. As Sarah and Mrs. Betty's investigation deepened, the atmosphere in Pine Valley began to subtly change. Suspicious glances were exchanged in the streets, and hushed conversations abruptly ceased when strangers approached. The once peaceful town seemed to be on the verge of a revelation that would shake its foundations. One morning, Sarah arrived at the newspaper office to find her computer hacked, files deleted, and a threatening message on the screen. "Be careful where you dig. Some secrets should remain buried." The journalist, far from being intimidated, saw this as confirmation that she was on the right track. Mrs. Betty, meanwhile, began noticing unfamiliar cars parked for long periods near her house. "They think they can scare us," she told Sarah, with a surprising determination for her 65 years, "but they don't know who they're dealing with." Guardian. The Parrot, as if sensing the growing tension, intensified his activities. His reconnaissance flights became more frequent and daring. One day he returned with something that left Sarah speechless, a security badge from Elite Entertainment. "How did he get this?" asked Mrs. Betty, examining the object. "I don't know," replied Sarah, "but this could be our key to entering their next event." Using her investigative skills and the badge obtained by Guardian, Sarah managed to infiltrate an exclusive elite entertainment event. What she witnessed left her horrified. In a reserved area, away from the eyes of ordinary guests, members of the local elite were participating in an auction of exotic animals, many clearly mistreated and frightened. With her heart racing and using a small hidden recorder, Sarah documented conversations that implicated prominent figures in the town, including politicians and businessmen, in a network of animal trafficking and cruel entertainment. Meanwhile, Mrs. Betty coordinated a network of informants throughout the town. Neighbors, merchants, and even school-aged children began reporting sightings of suspicious vehicles and strange activities. Guardian the parrot seemed to be everywhere at once, like a winged sentinel alerting to unusual movements. The investigation took an unexpected turn when one of the rescued kittens, now a healthy, playful cat, escaped from Mrs. Betty's yard. Following the animal, she and Sarah were led to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the town. There they discovered empty transport cages and partially burned documents, suggesting an operation much larger than they had initially imagined. "This isn't just about Pine Valley," concluded Sarah, examining the papers. "It's a network that extends throughout the state, perhaps even the country." The discovery, however, did not go unnoticed. The next morning, Mrs. Betty woke to find her garden destroyed and a threatening message painted on her wall. "Last chance. Back off now." Far from being intimidated, the community united even more. Neighbors took turns watching Mrs. Betty's house, and the local newspaper, defying pressure, began publishing a series of articles exposing parts of the investigation. The turning point came when Guardian, in one of his flights, managed to capture surprising images with a small camera that Sarah had adapted for him. The photos clearly showed the town's mayor in a clandestine meeting with the organizers of elite entertainment events. With this evidence in hand, Sarah knew it was time to act. She prepared a complete dossier, including all the collected evidence, and simultaneously sent it to state authorities, national media, and animal protection organizations. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, Pine Valley found itself at the center of a media storm. Police cars and TV station vans invaded the quiet town. The mayor, in a hasty press conference, denied all accusations, but the nervousness in his voice was evident. As the town buzzed with the revelations, Mrs. Betty, Sarah, and a group of residents gathered in the newly restored garden. Guardian the parrot landed in the center of the group, as if presiding over the meeting. "What do we do now?" someone asked. Sarah smiled, determined. Now we ensure that the truth comes to light, no matter the cost." Mrs. Betty nodded, gently stroking Guardian's feathers. "And we ensure that no animal suffers at the hands of these criminals again." The sun was setting over Pine Valley, marking the end of an era of secrets and the beginning of a battle for justice that promised to transform not only the town, but perhaps the entire region. In the days following the initial revelations, Pine Valley transformed into a veritable center of frenzied activity. Journalists from across the country camped on the main streets, TV cameras broadcast live from every corner, and social media exploded with hashtags like "Justice in Pine Valley" and "Hero Guardian." Sarah, now nationally recognized for her investigative work, barely had time to breathe. Interviews, testimonies to authorities, and meetings with animal rights activists filled her days. However, she knew the battle was far from over. "They're trying to cover up the case," she told Mrs. Betty during a rare moment of calm in her garden. "The mayor has hired a team of high-profile lawyers and is threatening to sue for defamation." Mrs. Betty, absent-mindedly stroking Guardian, who was resting in her lap, responded with surprising determination. "Then we need to dig deeper. There's more to this story, I can feel it." And she was right. As the investigation expanded, new layers of the conspiracy began to reveal themselves. An anonymous City Hall employee contacted Sarah, providing documents showing how funds destined for animal protection programs had been diverted to accounts linked to elite entertainment. Meanwhile, Guardian continued his tireless vigil over the town. His flights, once viewed as a curiosity, were now closely followed by residents. Each time the parrot became agitated or flew in circles over a specific area, volunteers rushed to investigate, often discovering crucial evidence or preventing new cases of abandonment. The Pine Valley community, initially divided by the scandal, began to unite in surprising ways. A group of teenagers created an app to track and report suspicious activities related to animal mistreatment. Local merchants offered to shelter rescued animals, transforming stores and restaurants into temporary shelters. However, not all news was good. One night, Sarah received an alarming call from her contact in the police. "They're planning a major operation tonight. Something big is going to happen at Hope Woods." Without wasting time, the journalist mobilized her network of volunteers. Mrs. Betty, despite protests from her family, insisted on participating. "I won't sit idle while our town is in danger," she declared, placing Guardian on her shoulder. What? They found in the woods shocked even the most prepared. A large-scale operation was underway, with trucks ready to transport dozens of exotic animals, many of them endangered species. Elite Entertainment was trying to evacuate their stock before authorities could act. It was at this moment that Guardian truly showed why he was considered a hero. Flying between the trucks, he managed to create enough of a distraction for Sarah and the volunteers to alert authorities and prevent the criminals' escape. The scene that followed was chaotic, police arriving with sirens blaring, traffickers trying to flee, and frightened animals being freed from their cages. In the midst of it all, Mrs. Betty, with impressive courage, used her gardening knowledge to calm and care for the rescued animals. The operation in the woods was the turning point. With irrefutable evidence and eyewitnesses, including journalists, whom Sarah had strategically summoned, there was no longer any way to deny the existence of the criminal network. In the weeks that followed, a series of arrests shook the power structure of Pine Valley and neighboring towns. The mayor resigned. Amid a whirlwind of accusations, Elite Entertainment executives were indicted, and a federal investigation was opened to track the ramifications of the scheme at a national level. But for Sarah, Mrs. Betty, and the residents of Pine Valley, the work was just beginning. Exposing the criminal scheme was only the first step. Now they faced the challenge of rebuilding community trust, caring for rescued animals, and ensuring something like this never happened again. In a community meeting held in the same woods that had been the scene of the confrontation, Sarah presented an ambitious proposal to transform Pine Valley into a national model for protection and harmonious coexistence with animals. "We cannot change the past," she told the attentive crowd, with Guardian proudly perched on her shoulder, "but we can build a future where every life, human or animal, is valued and protected." As the sun set over Hope Woods, casting long shadows over the determined faces of the residents, it was clear that Pine Valley's story was far from over. In fact, a new chapter, full of challenges and hopes, was just beginning. The months following the exposure of the criminal scheme were ones of intense activity in Pine Valley. The town, once known for its tranquility, now buzzed with energy and purpose. The case had awakened not only indignation, but also a profound sense of collective responsibility. Sarah, now a national figure in the fight for animal rights, divided her time between interviews for major media outlets and coordinating local reconstruction efforts. Her room at the newspaper office had transformed into a veritable operations center, with maps, spreadsheets, and a constant flow of volunteers. "We can't let our guard down," she repeated in her daily meetings. "We've dismantled one network, but we know there are others." Mrs. Betty, for her part, channeled her passion for gardening into an ambitious project, transforming Hope Woods into a sanctuary for rescued animals. With the help of volunteer biologists and veterinarians, she supervised the creation of suitable habitats for the various species recovered from the Elite Entertainment operation. Guardian the Parrot, now a local celebrity, seemed to understand his new role. He accompanied Mrs. Betty on her rounds through the sanctuary, his attentive gaze catching any sign of disturbance or need among the animals. Meanwhile, the town underwent a profound transformation. The new interim government, pressured by public opinion, implemented a series of progressive measures. creation of a specialized department for animal welfare, educational programs in schools about respect for wildlife, and tax incentives for companies that adopted sustainable and ethical practices regarding animals. However, not everything was rosy. As Pine Valley became a symbol of resistance and change, opposing forces began to manifest. Businessmen linked to the old scheme, fearing losing their privileges, initiated a disinformation campaign, claiming that the new policies harmed the local economy. It was in this climate of tension that Sarah received alarming information. A group of investors was planning to build a large entertainment complex on the edges of the town, threatening environmental preservation areas. "They're trying to come back through the back door," she explained in an emergency meeting with community leaders. "We need to act quickly." The journalist knew that the battle would now be fought not only in the streets, but also in the key corridors of power and public opinion. She assembled a team of young digital activists to combat disinformation on social media and launched a series of investigative reports exposing the connections between the new investors and the old criminal scheme. Mrs. Betty, meanwhile, mobilized her extensive network of contacts. Local farmers, concerned about the environmental impact of the project, joined environmentalists from across the country in a series of peaceful protests, forming human chains around the threatened areas. The high point of this resistance came when Guardian, during one of his reconnaissance flights, discovered a secret meeting between investors and corrupt politicians at an isolated farm. Sarah, alerted by the Parrot's agitated behavior, managed to capture compromising images that, once released, caused a national scandal. The pressure of public opinion became unsustainable. The entertainment complex project was cancelled, and a federal investigation was opened to look into the new allegations of corruption. This victory, however, came at a price. Sarah and Mrs. Betty began receiving veiled threats. Unfamiliar cars began to frequently circulate in front of their houses, and intimidating messages appeared in their mailboxes. Far from being intimidated, the duo saw this as a sign that they were on the right track. "They only attack when they feel cornered," observed Sarah during one of her long nighttime conversations with Mrs. Betty. The community, perceiving the danger, united even more. A community surveillance system was established, with neighbors taking turns to ensure the safety of Sarah, Mrs. Betty, and other prominent activists. Meanwhile, work at the sanctuary continued. The rescued animals, many of them traumatized by years of mistreatment, began to show signs of recovery. Guardian seemed to have a special role in this process, his calm and vigilant presence bringing comfort not only to humans but also to other animals. One night, watching the parrot gently interact with a rescued baby monkey, Mrs. Betty had an epiphany. "We're not just saving animals," she told Sarah. "We're relearning how to be human." As autumn approached, bringing a cool breeze and the promise of change, Pine Valley prepared for another chapter in its transformation journey. The fight was far from over, but the town had found its voice and its purpose. Sarah, looking toward the horizon of her hometown, now so different yet so familiar, felt a wave of renewed determination. "We'll continue," she thought, "no matter what comes our way." Winter came to Pine Valley, bringing not only the cold, but also a palpable atmosphere of tension. The advances made in recent months had shaken deeply rooted power structures, and now the forces opposing change were preparing their counterattack. Sarah, on a cold July morning, received an anonymous envelope containing documents suggesting a much larger conspiracy than they had initially imagined. The evidence pointed to an interstate network of animal trafficking, with ramifications that reached the highest echelons of the state government. "This is bigger than Pine Valley," she told Mrs. Betty, spreading the papers across the kitchen table. "If this information is correct, we're dealing with something that could shake the entire country." Mrs. Betty, with Guardian perched on her shoulder, examined the documents with a grave expression. "The deeper we dig, the more dirt we find. But we can't back down now." In the days that followed, Sarah and her team worked tirelessly to verify and corroborate each piece of information. Guardian, as if sensing the urgency of the situation, intensified his patrols around the town, often returning with pieces of paper or objects that, inexplicably, always seemed relevant to the investigation. Meanwhile, at the Hopewood Sanctuary, Mrs. Betty noticed an alarming increase in the number of injured or sick animals being brought in for care. Many showed signs of mistreatment consistent with the practices of clandestine testing laboratories. "They're accelerating their operations," concluded Sarah after visiting the sanctuary. "They know we're close to exposing them and are trying to maximize their profits before everything comes crashing down." The situation reached a critical point when, during a town meeting to discuss new animal protection laws, a group of protesters, opposed to the changes, invaded the venue. The chaos that ensued was captured live by TV cameras, showing the entire country the battle being fought in Pine Valley. It was in this moment of crisis that Guardian once again proved his extraordinary value. Flying over the agitated crowd, the Parrot managed to create enough of a distraction for Sarah and other community leaders to calm tempers and regain control of the situation. The incident, far from discouraging the defenders of the animal cause, served as a catalyst. Citizens, who until then had remained neutral, found themselves compelled to take a stand. The hashtag #ChangeWeStandWithPineValley became a national trend, and demonstrations of support began to emerge in various cities across the country. Sensing the tide turning, the leaders of the criminal network decided it was time for drastic action. On a stormy night, Sarah received an anonymous phone call. "They're going to attack the sanctuary, now." Without losing a second, she activated her network of contacts. Within minutes, volunteers from all over town were converging on Hope Woods, forming a human barrier around the sanctuary. The scene that followed seemed straight out of an action movie. Trucks and armored vehicles tried to force their way into the woods, only to be stopped by the unwavering determination of the citizens of Pine Valley. Guardian soared overhead, his strident cry serving as a battle cry for the defenders. At the height of the confrontation, when violence seemed inevitable, something extraordinary happened. The animals in the sanctuary, led by a majestic lion, rescued months earlier, began to roar and cry out in unison. The sound, amplified by the natural acoustics of the woods, was deafening and moving. The invaders, confronted not only by human resistance but also by the clamor of the very animals they intended to exploit, hesitated. In that moment of pause, Sarah saw her chance. Advancing to the front line, she raised a megaphone. "You're being filmed and broadcast live to the entire country. Your identities are known, and authorities are on their way. This is your last chance to back down." For a few tense seconds, the future of Pine Valley, and perhaps the entire animal protection movement in the country, seemed to hang by a thread. Then slowly the vehicles began to retreat. When the first light of morning broke the horizon, illuminating Hope Woods, it was clear that a crucial battle had been won. The images of the confrontation, broadcast live and shared millions of times on social media, had once and for all exposed the brutality and greed behind animal exploitation. Sarah, exhausted but triumphant, watched Guardian land gently on her shoulder. "Is it over?" she asked the Parrot rhetorically. Mrs. Betty, approaching with a tired smile, replied, "No, my dear, this is just the beginning." As the sun rose over Pine Valley, illuminating a town transformed by the courage and determination of its citizens, it was clear that a new era was beginning, an era of respect, compassion, and harmony between humans and animals. A year had passed since the fateful night at Hope Woods. Pine Valley, once a quiet town in the countryside, had transformed into the epicenter of a national revolution in animal rights protection. Autumn painted the trees with shades of gold and red, symbolizing the transformation the community had undergone. Sarah, now internationally recognized as one of the leading voices in animal defense, walked the streets of her hometown with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. Store windows displayed posters promoting responsible adoption, restaurants proudly announced their vegan menus, and children played in parks under the watchful eye of rescued dogs, now an integral part of the municipal guard. "Who would have thought we'd come so far?" she murmured to Guardian, who as always was perched on her shoulder. The Parrot, now a national symbol of resistance and hope, softly chirped Pine Valley in response, making Sarah smile. In the heart of the town, the former elite entertainment, building had been transformed into an environmental education center and free veterinary clinic. Mrs. Betty, tireless as always despite her now 66 years, coordinated a group of children in a class about the importance of biodiversity. "Remember, little ones," she said with a sparkle in her eyes, "every creature, no matter how small, has an important role in our world." The Hope Wood Sanctuary, scene of the final confrontation a year ago, had flourished beyond the most optimistic expectations. What was once a modest preservation area now extended for miles, connecting to other parks in the region and forming a vital ecological corridor for various species. But not everything was rosy. The fight against animal exploitation was continuous, and Sarah knew this better than anyone. Her investigation had triggered a series of legal proceedings and investigations that were still ongoing. Corrupt politicians and unscrupulous businessmen had been arrested, but the journalist was aware that other threats could emerge. "Vigilance is the price of freedom," she frequently reminded the citizens of Pine Valley in her weekly talks in the Central Plaza. That afternoon, Sarah had a special commitment. The state government, pressured by public opinion and inspired by the example of Pine Valley, was about to approve the most comprehensive animal protection legislation ever seen in the country. The journalist had been invited to speak at the Legislative Assembly. As she prepared for the trip, reflecting on the speech she would give, Sarah was surprised by an unexpected visit. Frank, Mrs. Betty's husband, appeared at her door with a worried expression. "It's Betty," he said, breathless. "She fainted at the sanctuary. They're taking her to the hospital now." Sarah's heart froze. Within minutes, she was at the hospital, Guardian faithfully by her side, awaiting news. The hours dragged on, each minute seeming like an eternity. Finally, the doctor appeared with reassuring news. Mrs. Betty was fine, just exhausted due to her tireless work pace. She would need rest, but would recover completely. Relieved, but still shaken by the scare, Sarah entered the hospital room. Mrs. Betty, pale but smiling, was holding Frank's hand. "Don't worry, dear," said the lady, her voice weak but determined. "It'll take more than a fainting spell to bring me down." Sarah felt tears in her eyes. "You need to take care of yourself, Mrs. Betty. Pine Valley needs you. I need you." It was at this moment that Guardian, who had remained silent until then, uttered a phrase that left everyone speechless. "Family, care, love." The silence that followed was broken by Mrs. Betty's emotional laughter. "See," she said, "even Guardian knows what's really important." That moment in the hospital crystallized something Sarah had been feeling for months. The fight for animal rights, as noble as it was, could not come at the cost of the well-being of those we love. In the days that followed, as Mrs. Betty recovered, the Pine Valley community united in an even deeper way. Volunteers took turns caring for the sanctuary, neighbors prepared meals for the family, and even former opponents offered help. When the day of the vote at the Legislative Assembly finally arrived, Sarah took to the podium with a renewed clarity. Her speech, broadcast live to the entire country, was not just about animal rights, but about empathy, community, and the transformative power of love. What happened in Pine Valley, she concluded, with Guardian proudly perched on her shoulder, was not just a victory for animals. It was a reminder of our shared humanity, of our connection with all forms of life. By protecting the most vulnerable, we become stronger. By opening our hearts to other creatures, we rediscover the best in ourselves. The law was approved unanimously, a historic victory that would echo for generations. But for Sarah, Mrs. Betty, and the citizens of Pine Valley, it was just another step in an ongoing journey. That night, gathered in Mrs. Betty's garden, now recovered and more determined than ever, the friends reflected on all they had accomplished and the challenges that still lay ahead. "You know," said Mrs. Betty, gently stroking Guardian's feathers, "when all this began, I thought we were saving animals. Now I see that in reality they saved us." Sarah nodded, looking up at the starry sky above. The future was still uncertain, full of challenges and possibilities. But one thing was clear: the story of Pine Valley, of Guardian, and of all those who united for a cause greater than themselves would continue to inspire and transform lives, both human and animal, for many years to come. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that the journey of Sarah, Mrs. Betty, and the incredible guardian, Parrot has touched your hearts. This story of courage, compassion, and transformation is just one of many inspiring narratives we have to share. If you were moved by Pine Valley's struggle, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. We've prepared a special playlist with other equally captivating stories about the relationship between humans and animals. You can find it by clicking the link on the left. Each day we bring new stories that explore the complexity and beauty of life in all its forms. Together we can make a difference. Share your own experiences and reflections in the comments below. Remember, every voice counts, every action matters. Until the next story.